Subscribe to Laurie Margud's YouTube channel, hit the little bell to see everything that happens on the channel. And you can comment that I am handsome, very very handsome.
Yeah, and her guardians prevented her from returning to the only life she had ever known, during which time she felt marginalized, captive and unhappy in what had always been paradise for her. Her maternal grandparents died, and when she was a minor, her paternal family had no choice but to take care of her. "Your parents have turned you into a real good-for-nothing," was the first thing her grandfather Humberto de Hurtado said to her when she arrived at his house, a mansion with a 19th-century style inside and out. Everything in that place looked musty and lifeless. Even the light was forbidden to enter through the large velvet curtains that covered all the windows. "I think you are the really useless one." She lived in that house without light and affection for 2 years, and at the age of 19 she hired a lawyer to find out exactly why. Being someone detestable to her grandfather, he continued to keep her in that place, where silences were much more pleasant than words that were never spoken except to annoy. She found Mr. Lopez on the internet and liked him as soon as she saw him. In 3 months she went from being a hostage to holding the key to her father's family business. Thanks to Mr. Lopez, who turned out to be everything she had dreamed of, she reversed all the powers of attorney that her grandfather had made her sign over the last 2 years. The shares that her father inherited from her mother and those that were donated by her grandfather constituted 15% of the total of the Fortuna Company. 45% belonged to her grandfather, her uncle had 15%, and the rest was divided among the descendants of her great-great-grandfather, whom her grandfather Humberto was cornering until he became the maximum shareholder in the company. It took her a year to realize the extent of her wealth. It was enough but not enough to maintain the palace. She sold it with all the pain in her heart and bought a house in a housing estate in Las Rosas. While Mr. Lopez took care of everything, she returned to the place where her life changed. Nothing was the same there. The people were different. Those she knew had to escape the armed raids, and at this point, what was once a village built with effort and hope had become a village of rubble that sheltered only fugitives. From Dr. Mejías he learned that Laszlo had been forcibly re-recruited. The doctor had left his volunteer field work to become a high commissioner at UNICEF. "I have no heart left," the doctor confessed. "I have lost faith in changing things permanently, and to put plasters on bomb wounds. I prefer to do it from an office. It doesn't hurt so much. Whatever you need, you can count on me." The feeling of loss without remission was too intense for a woman in her early 20s. She had no friends and no real purpose, nor did she want them. For the next 8 years he devoted himself to drawing, and it was Mr. Lopez who advised him to market his caricatures. The only way he could think of was to put them on t-shirts and pajamas. Her contact with the world was Mr. Lopez and Dr. Mejías, with whom she collaborated by financing those projects that were forgotten by UNICEF. Emilia came into her life recommended by the lawyer. She was the housekeeper who organized and managed the house so that nothing would disturb Laura. 2 employees worked only during the day, but Laura did not see them, nor did they get to know the one who paid their salaries. Mr. Lopez, because Laura wanted the clothes to be made in developing countries through cooperatives that she financed through Mr. Mejías, had considered it best to create several companies in the cities of origin of the production and in Holland, due to the issue of tariffs and taxes, which prevented her grandfather, even if he wanted to control her, from having access to information about her assets. The deterioration of Humberto de Hurtado, who was almost 80 years old, led his uncle, Junior, as he was called in the family and in the company, to call an extraordinary meeting where the ineptitude of age would become evident. Her grandfather, who had stopped speaking to her since she left the house, went to see her in person when the junta announced that it intended to dethrone him. "I need you to sign this power of attorney to use your shares at the meeting." There was no greeting, she just read the document and signed it. "Mr. Lopez will pass on the numbering of the shares. I know perfectly well the number of your shares. I gave them to your father. I have some more. Have your lawyer contact me before noon tomorrow. You do not need to attend the meeting. I won't go. Don't expect me to thank you for letting me use what is mine anyway. If I wanted you to thank me, I would deny you until you begged me, but I don't find the idea amusing. You are still exactly the same, Neither your character nor your manners have improved in the slightest. 2 hours after his grandfather left, he was visited by his uncle Humberto and his cousin Carlos. In this case, formalities had to be maintained. They were invited to sit in the lounge, and even accepted the coffee he offered them. "It's been a while," said his uncle when the coffee arrived. Her cousin Carlos was looking at her with an intensity that was bothering her a lot. Laura was not used to feeling annoyed and she stirred restlessly in the armchair where she was. She fixed her attention on her uncle. "Yes, it's something I've regretted, but time has gone by and seeing that everything is going well for you, that's enough for me. Thank you for your concern. I assume this visit has nothing to do with the extraordinary company meeting." "Actually, yes." He tried to look embarrassed. "Carlos and I intend to turn the company around, modernize and globalize it. We would like to count on you in this whole process. Carlos could be your guide and your friend in this whole process." Her hair stood on end when she saw her cousin smile. Any woman would have been attracted to a man like him, but she found the way he looked at her repulsive. She couldn't help imagining that he saw her as if she were a needy woman. "I don't have much interest in the company, but I have already given grandfather the power of attorney to use my shares." "I guess he left you no choice," his uncle commented. "I don't think it makes much difference, but you should have contacted us. After all, we are the future of your dividends." "I hope that my dividends will continue to arrive on time, whoever is in charge of the company. After all, at the moment the shares will be used by grandfather, but in the future they will probably be at your disposal." "Have you thought about selling them?" asked his cousin Carlos. The seductive attitude ceased to make sense and reverted to its predatory form. "No, I'm sorry. Maybe we can tempt you." The cousin held out an envelope. She took it and looked at the check for 10 million euros. That was the value of the shares she had bought over the last few years. If she sold all the shares she owned at the price she was being offered, she could make over 40 million euros. But for her the Fortuna shares were the closest thing to having a personal purpose, which may or may not happen. "I'm sorry." They left as soon as they finished their conversation and coffee. She could guess the pent-up anger that accompanied their departure. To her surprise, her grandfather went to visit her again after the meeting, where with his number of family shares and those he had acquired with his T-shirts he had made a significant difference in favor of her continued presidency. "Did you ever plan to tell me that you were a majority shareholder in the company?" As always, his grandfather seemed to disdain greetings as a polite way to start a conversation. "We are both of us a few words. If you wanted my attention, you got it. What are you really after? Some kind of revenge? Your attention is quite annoying and I am not in the habit of explaining myself. I am glad the actions have been of some use." "Here," said her grandfather, handing her what she thought was the power of his actions, so she just held it in her hands. "Aren't you going to read it?" She looked past him. There was no change of expression on her face. "Why? I will prepare you to be my successor in the company." She left the document on the hall table, where they were sitting, and returned with another envelope to her grandfather, who was sitting in the living room and had ordered Mrs. Amelia to serve him coffee. He handed her the envelope. When he opened it, he saw several medical reports and read them carefully. "Is this the reason you haven't left this house for years? What the hell does it mean that you can't relate to other people?" It was also the real reason for his success with T-shirts, a sociopathy that prevented him from telling the world how much he hated it, but he had plenty of cats to fulfill this mission. "It means that I don't give a shit about the world, and I don't give a shit about my family, that I do exactly what I want to do when I want to do it, but I do it alone because people really annoy me. The psychiatrist thinks it's possible that I haven't received enough family affection. What do you think? Are you disrespecting me because I depend on your actions? Am I being disrespectful? I thought I was being polite. It was exciting to see you again. In the future contact Mr. Lopez directly." "Exciting?" She nodded as indifferently as ever. "Your mother was a strange woman. I suppose children can't help resembling their parents. I can take after my paternal grandfather and leave the use of my shares to Uncle Humbert. Would you like that? This disorder makes you only unpleasant, which is not necessarily a defect, but why does it prevent you from going out in the street?" "It doesn't stop me, I just don't want to." I will come for lunch every Sunday from now on. I won't be home on Sundays from now on, but you can say what you want to eat and I'll order it to be prepared for you. I'd like to get to know my granddaughter better, can't I? As long as the granddaughter you are referring to is not me, you can. I thought you were an idiot. The sad thing is that, in order not to be considered an idiot, you have to be unpleasant, as if intelligence and kindness cannot walk together. Can they? I haven't met anyone intelligent, so I don't have enough judgment to say one way or the other. I didn't even remotely think you could be that interesting. Grandfather, you should have a diagnosis too, not that it's any good, but it's nice to have papers. He emphasized these last words. 3 months later, his grandfather passed away. To everyone's surprise, Laura was named universal heir, so her uncle only inherited half of 1/3 of the family estate. Unwittingly, she was the company's largest shareholder, as well as a not inconsiderable fortune. Her cousin Carlos came to visit her again. This time the check had his name in place of the bearer. The humble forms did not hide an ulterior motive that did not go unnoticed by Laura. "I'm not interested in buying," he simply said after listening patiently for 10 minutes over coffee. "You can have the presidency with the backing of my shares, if you are interested." "In exchange for what?" "There is nothing I want from you, but if there is in the future I will inform you immediately. Take this kind of thing up with Mr. Lopez, he earns a lot of money for taking care of it. I think we should get back to family relations. I'm sure I wouldn't like you very much and it would be a headache to have to elect another president." It was not easy to have to put up with the impertinence of someone who had never been given more value than that of an expendable pawn. Now the pawn was the king and queen, and without their protection he would be just another shareholder with no right to manage the company. "I don't like to be anyone's pawn. The pawn and the king have the same moves, the difference is that when the king dies the game is over. You won't notice whether you are pawn or king unless you bother me. If you are interested in the offer, discuss these and all other matters with Mr. Lopez." Not that she didn't mourn her grandfather's death, but she'd had enough grief in her life. She was corked as far as the pain was concerned, it just hit softly without reaching important parts. The inheritance was too tempting, but it was proving to be a nuisance, the most important of which was having to leave his comfort zone, where he had everything he needed. He had inherited some properties and companies that had never been declared in Spain, so thanks to Brexit he could claim them through the American embassy in London, something that was essential financially, but quite inconvenient personally, although better England than America. 2. Jeremy Chang Say was heir to more than 10 business conglomerates stretching back several generations of his family. His family tree, like that of the kings, could be traced back to the beginning of trade in Asia and North America. His family had been light years away from the world's top 10 fortunes since his great-great-grandfather, and, although new technologies now seem to have produced nouveau riches, they were sustained by his old money. So as his maternal grandfather used to say on a regular basis, like a mantra, rankings are for those who don't know their worth, those who know their worth don't need to be on any list. Like kings, even more so than kings, who ultimately could choose to marry outside royal houses, their marriages were decided according to family interests to the music of shareholders' meetings. From $10,000 billion upwards there was a circle of individuals who lived in a world parallel to the real world, recognizable by the places they went to, the clothes they wore, and the shiny VIP card, which allowed them to buy a plane or an island in the Pacific. In everything else they were configured as normal humans. What set Jeremy apart from the rest of his family, from all of them, was that, as the 5th child of the 3rd marriage, he did not bear the surname Betson, but that of his maternal grandfather, who had tried, unsuccessfully so far, to take him under his wing as he would be his heir. Jeremy much preferred his father's family, much warmer in affection and allowing him to do his own bidding without trying to lead him down the paths of power and ambition. His grandfather tried whenever he could to draw him into his future responsibilities as his heir, but being the only one who tried to bind him in any way, he developed a natural aversion to him. He would be the heir to one of the 3 largest fortunes in Asia, but he counted on his brother, who took care of managing all his assets so that he could enjoy absolute freedom. His older brother, Marcus Betson, was divorcing his wife due to the bankruptcy of her family's company, which they used as an opportunity to challenge him for the presidency of the Toscana Corporation Consortium. So he had to find an agreement that would allow him to continue with the management rights. As in the kingdoms of antiquity, an agreement based on blood ties was the best solution. Marcus showed up at Jeremy's duplex across the street from Central Park in Manhattan. "I need your help. If it's something I can do, you know you can count on it. If you agree, you will be married next Monday at the American Embassy in London. I hope the bride is a woman. We've never discussed my heterosexuality, but this is a good time to do it." Jeremy's smile always reached his crescent eyes, a legacy of his Asian ancestry, and it was his best quality, a friendliness that rubbed off on others effortlessly. "You always make me smile, even in the murkiest of times," said his brother. He was sincere, his life was designed for business and used to winning. He had lost the thrill. "They've seized my wife's shares. I've already filed for divorce, but they're still planning to remove me from the presidency." "Who is the bride?" "Your secretary has all the details. For once be serious. Don't joke, at least until you've signed the papers. Then it's up to you to put up with it or not." "Why do you say that? Am I not loved by everyone who knows me? I'm Jeremy Love." "Who is she?" "Deborah Spencer." "Does she agree to this marriage? Have you had any problems with her?" "Define problem. What happened?" "I'm not quite sure. Whatever it is, the family is in agreement, so she will marry you, and you will have time to clear up any misunderstandings on the honeymoon. Since you are going to London, tell the others to attend the meeting. I am the least brotherly of all our brothers." "Yes, and the most adorable. That's why we always trust you." The brothers smiled in complicity. Jeremy was a very handsome man. His oriental features gave him a feminine touch, his gym-worked body was perfect in dimensions, and the tailor-made clothes subtly marked every muscle in his body. They could not have been more different in looks and character. Marcus's family came from European bankers and aristocrats, so his blonde hair and blue eyes had been a prince to all the potential Cinderellas who read the magazines where high society was photographed. Now, past 40, the appeal had not diminished at all. For his part, Jeremy had the features of his mother, Japanese. His eyes seemed painted on his crescent-shaped face. His nose, however, was somewhat more prominent than one would expect in an Asian. He had full lips that made women dream of their touch and taste. 28 years old, his relationships were always sporadic. Women were like everything else in his life, something to be enjoyed without limits. He was not exactly a womanizer, but he always had the woman he wanted at any given moment. Marcus had been born with the predatory family gene, and Jeremy was a hedonist. While the former could not live without studying mergers and bankruptcies, Jeremy could not stand having a constant obligation. He could be useful at specific moments, but he did not take on permanent obligations. One might think that marriage would be in this category, but not for Jeremy, who did not even consider changing his lifestyle for a moment. If Deborah was interesting, they could stay married until eternity. Otherwise, once the financial crisis was over, he would divorce. Consummating the marriage was not going to be easy, although technically it was consummated. The assets of the family corporation were freely used by family members, subject of course to availability, but having a plane to leave for London 2 hours after receiving the mandate was nothing out of the ordinary for the Betson family, so the crew and catering were ready when he arrived. On his arrival in London, he was greeted by Margot and Muriel, Marcus's full sisters and only half-sisters. "We can't come to your marriage, but Marcus said we'll celebrate properly after the meeting," was Margot's greeting after blowing him a kiss by the ear. He cringed as if a bomb had been dropped instead of a small crack. "You're very annoying," she protested. "I can't come with you either," shrugged Muriel. "I have to be in Paris tonight and won't be back until Thursday. It's quite possible that my wife would be intimidated by sisters-in-law like you." They shrugged their shoulders at the same time. "We'll eat together," Muriel said. "What about Jael? Locatable. Let's hope you have better luck. Where is he supposed to be this time? Saving the world? Or something like that? Marcus wants him on the board, just like you. We will be there, of course, but unless Marcus asks for it personally, I am not going to give him my support." "Margot, I'm asking you." "He's no good at asking." "I would like to have your Oriental agreement for everything. If you think my conformity has anything to do with my Asian background, I'll take you to meet my grandfather one day, but you'll have to do it without telling him. He doesn't like light-eyed people, they make him nervous. Your mother is a sweetheart. I can't believe your grandfather is so different. You only have to see that he got our father, being who he is and what he is, to renounce giving me the family name. I never thought of it that way. I thought you had a better chance of chairing one of their companies that way. Both have to do with each other, but it could very well do with the name Betson. I would like you to introduce me to your grandfather. Every time you mention him, my curiosity about him grows. Insurance. Let's do it, said Margot, amused. Jeremy smiled only with his mouth. His eyes did not catch his mood. If anyone could disturb him, it was his grandfather. His charms never managed to soften the firm will of the president of the Chansey Empire. He could get Marcus to keep the presidency of Toscana Corporation by just lifting a finger, but his brother knew it was more manageable for him to marry a stranger than to ask his grandfather for support. The Betsons with all their power could be little more than puppets if old Chansey so decided. This was Jeremy's greatest fear, a threat never uttered but ever present. So much so, that he never allowed the Betsons access to his property. He once asked him the reason for keeping him apart from his family. His grandfather's slanting eyes looked deep into his own. I may have to destroy them all one day. I'd rather not be fond of them. His words always echoed in his head despite the years that had passed. He managed to communicate with Jael, a half-brother to all of them, born from his father's second marriage, which ended when he was 8 years old. His mother was a South African mulatto. Because of his genes, Jael got all the looks wherever he went, a cinnamon skin and blue eyes like the evening sky. His genetics had defined his way of being. He seemed to be always in the middle of everything, but without belonging to any place, no family, no country, no business. His heritage being important would not have allowed him to belong to the Vips if it were not for his brothers. "What are you doing?" Jeremy asked over the phone line. "Not very much. We are trying to improve conditions on the coffee plantations, but they keep putting unbearable tariffs on them. In the end, we are going to distribute through my company, but it is not a good solution, neither for them nor for us. Why don't you let Marcus help you with the distribution?" It was his way of telling her that the conversation was too big for him. "I don't want you to marry me at your convenience." The tone clearly showed how little sympathy he felt for his elder brother. The reproach also touched him, but he would not be taken in. "You're not that good a catch," Jeremy joked. He could feel his brother's smile on the other end of the phone. Jeremy really was a basket case. "I thank God for that." "Is he a god I know?" "Surely not. He doesn't move in your circles," Jael joked. "Bring it to the board of Toscana Corporation. Let me know 2 days in advance so I don't forget. If you don't have a secretary, it's not my fault. Put it on your forehead. The 15th of March in Lausanne. I'll be there. Are you taking your wife?" "I imagine he'll be on his own. That's the good thing about having legs. There is no need for legs with so many private planes. I'll leave you. I don't like to use the government satellite. They look at me funny. See you on the 15th. 3. Leaving the house was a real pain for Laura, so she tried to think of ways of not having to deal with too many people. She bought 2 first-class tickets to board directly and make sure she would not have a seatmate. As soon as boarding started, problems began. A plane of the same company had collapsed and the passengers were changed to their flight, so first class was not the lonely and quiet place I had expected. The lawyer who picked her up on arrival was not the same one with whom she had had previous conversations and did not know Spanish. She was not in the mood for any conversation, especially not in English. She let herself be taken to the embassy. At least there she was served a small snack in a private room. They waited for half an hour. She was alone with the lawyer, who fortunately did not make any attempt to communicate with her either. At about 12 o'clock in the morning, 2 more people arrived. The lawyer introduced them and could understand that one of them was the ambassador. He deduced that the other person was some sort of secretary because as soon as he entered the room he began to prepare the documentation. Although he understood everything they were saying, he made no sign of it, merely planning caricatures of cats with the appearance of those present. The situation was becoming uncomfortable. More than 2 hours have passed and no one present was saying anything. All of them seemed nervous and annoyed, nothing to do with the bad mood that was building up inside them. I have a plane to catch, can we sign the documents now? They seemed surprised to hear him speak English. The three men looked at each other, looked at the clock, and the ambassador muttered something that she did not hear. Finally they indicated to her to come to the table where all the documentation was prepared. She signed without bothering to read. She was too impatient and anxious to leave. They gave her back the passport that she had handed in on arrival. She put her hand out to receive, and surprisingly the ambassador began to communicate with her in Spanish. Once Mr. Betson has signed, we will send you the documentation. I hope it won't be necessary to go back, he said in English. He just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible so as not to miss the 16:30 flight. His tone and attitude did not seem to come as much of a surprise to those present, who, in spite of some rather improvable manners, were absolutely polite. I imagined that his grandfather's fortune must be much more important than Mr. Lopez had deduced. Barely 2 steps out of the office, she bumped into the body of a man of over 6 feet tall. She was able to dodge him before he, who already had a smile shining in his crescent-shaped eyes, could say anything to her. As soon as he set foot on the street, he took a taxi, and that same afternoon he was at his home in Madrid. Dressed in pajamas of her own creation with a caricature of an old cat hugging a piggy bank rather greedily and a motto, "Let me hold your quarters for you." She was taking notes on the iPad on lapidary phrases that had occurred to her during the day. The only good thing about watching people was that they inspired her characters to say what she would have wanted to say from her point of view, only slightly less corrosive than quicklime. If she said what she really thought, it would surely provoke a reaction that would lead inexorably to a discussion, which meant talking, and laziness was greater than her need to have an opinion. Miss Amelia, who was the only person on duty authorized to interrupt her, handed her the phone. "It's England's lawyer. He asks why he hasn't turned up." Laura looked at the device with disgust and put it to her ear. "First of all, can you explain why you had an associate accompany me instead of yourself?" "I was personally at the departure gate of his flight and he never got off the plane," he said over the phone. "Someone picked me up on the plane and took me directly to the embassy, where I signed the documents. Could you check and call me back?" "I have already checked. The documents are still awaiting your signature. I remind you that you have to sign them within a month or you will have to pay the inheritance tax, which will halve the amount." "All right, I will prepare the reservations for the trip. I will send you an email with all the details. In your reply please attach a photo of yourself so that this time there are no mistakes." When he hung up, he wondered what he had signed and hoped he had not been the victim of a scam or similar. He dismissed the idea immediately. The only explanation was that there had been an identity mistake, but they had taken his passport for the elaboration of the documents. A person with the same name signing at the embassy was an absurd explanation, an impossible coincidence. The next day he was at the Athenaeum Hotel in the centre of London. The English lawyer had not been able to get any information about the documents he had supposedly signed the day before, but he had managed to get an appointment to sign Humberto Diostado's inheritance that same day in the afternoon. The night before, Marcus Betson had received a call from the representative of the Spencer Group who, by way of apology for the bride's failure to appear in the marriage affair, had put all the shares at his disposal, something that puzzled the eldest of the family, who had received confirmation of the marriage on the same Monday as soon as the papers were signed. Curiously, the news did not make Marcus uncomfortable. On the contrary, he smiled with satisfaction. Because he had already secured the majority of votes for the board that would allow him to continue as president of the corporation, he decided to meet with Jeremy in London, where he was still staying. The family's private planes were late models with all kinds of unimaginable luxuries, leather seats that converted into comfortable beds for transoceanic flights, but the president's plane was designed as a 2-room flat, with the living room at the entrance, then an office and finally a bedroom complete with double bed, dressing room and bathroom complete with shower and a bathtub with water jets that had not yet been used for the first time. The aircraft had his name silk-screened on the back, and only the crew and service were allowed to enter the aircraft without prior authorization. Arrived in London in the morning, due to jet lag, met with the ambassador on Tuesday afternoon. At the embassy they insist he was never there. The lawyer insisted until Laura's gaze clearly indicated to him that he could die if he continued to insist on the question. My psychiatrist will be happy to see that I now have hallucinations. This afternoon the misunderstanding will be resolved anyway. The lawyer did not quite understand the meaning of his words. Two groups of people arrived at the embassy at the same time, like a synchronized dance. On the one hand, Laura and her lawyer, who had to go through several security systems where they had to take off their shoes and be searched by security guards, and the one formed by Marcus and Jeremy with two secretaries and the lawyer who attended the signing the day before. They entered directly without passing through any controls and were taken to the ambassador's private room. While the ambassador was trying to understand where and how the mistake had occurred, someone entered the room with the expression of having something important to say. He whispered something to the ambassador. I think we can fix the mistake right now. Escort the lady and her companion here. Laura was looking at the covers of the tourist brochures that were scattered in an almost millimetric order on the table in the room where they were waiting for the official to call them. None of them caught her attention enough to pick it up and look at it more closely. An embassy official arrived in a hurry and with excessive delicacy invited them to follow them to the room she recognized from the previous day. What the hell did you sign yesterday? He asked the ambassador without preamble. There seems to have been a slight misunderstanding. Laura was annoyed, so she used Spanish to communicate, and the ambassador did the same. I have had to travel 2 consecutive days from Madrid, just because there has been a little misunderstanding. I have no patience or humor for useless chats. Please bring my grandfather's documentation so that I can return to Spain and explain to my lawyer the consequences of what I signed yesterday. I will not assume any responsibility for that. The fault is entirely yours. Maybe he should have read what he signed, interjected Marcus, who was horrified just imagining that because of him his brother was married to such an ordinary woman. His Spanish sounded with a Mexican accent. Right. Sometimes I forget that competent people are in danger of extinction. Whatever the problem is, said Laura's lawyer in English, thinking it would be easier to reduce the tension. Yesterday my client was supposed to come with me, but someone intercepted her and brought her straight to the embassy, so I didn't have a chance to examine the documentation she apparently signed by mistake. Laura pointed to the man who had picked her up on the plane the day before. He shrunk inwardly. It was clear that he was solely responsible for what had happened and he did not seem to have any convincing explanation. Although he tried. Miss Spencer was on the flight that was transferred to the Spanish flight. They told me the seat number and I thought it was her. He said, pointing to her. Didn't anyone notice that Mr. Ostado and Miss Spencer don't even resemble each other in their vowels? Asked Laura. Let's forget the past, interrupted the Spaniard's lawyer. Let's sign the documents we have come to sign and annul what was signed here yesterday. To annul what was signed here yesterday we will have to go to court, said Jeremy, smiling. He approached Laura, who took a step back to keep her distance. My name is Jeremy Chansey, I'm your husband. I want a divorce, he merely said, thinking it was an unfunny joke. 4. His lawyer examined the documentation. You are right, you signed a marriage certificate. He read it twice, as if he could not believe its contents, a marriage certificate with an appendix stipulating the conditions of divorce. The marriage is legal and valid, as American laws in these matters are much more lax than in Europe. In case of divorce, Mr. Chansey must compensate you in the manner set out in the annex, which is also signed. Send me the divorce papers to Madrid and I'll sign them. There is nothing to make up. But let's finish my business first. She told the ambassador, who instructed the official who had informed him of Mrs. Chansey's presence to bring them to her for signing. The lawyer looked them over, nodded, and Laura proceeded to sign them. The ambassador personally affixed his seal and signature. Aren't we going to have a wedding night? Jeremy joked, smiling at her in amusement, pretending to look seductive. She looked up at him and smiled, but unlike Jeremy's, Laura's seemed to promise physical violence. If you want to die. She looked him straight in the eyes, which kept smiling. She liked him, but she was not in the mood for fooling around. I personally have no preference between being a widow or a divorcee. As soon as Laura opened the door to leave the room, Marcus stepped between her and the doorway. "We haven't finished talking. I finished listening." He took her forcefully by the arm and took her to one of the armchairs where he sat her down by force. Everyone was left without knowing what to do, even Laura, but in her case, it took her 3 seconds to get up again. When he tried to sit her down again by force, she kneed him in the crotch. His body buckled to the floor, too shocked and in pain to react as he watched her leave. "It looks like you're not going to get along with your sister-in-law," said Jeremy, holding out his arm to help him up. His sisters didn't know whether to laugh or be outraged. While Jeremy smiled in amusement as he recounted the assault, Marcus seemed determined to torture and murder the woman who had literally brought him to his knees. No one in his life had ever dared to raise their voice to him. Touching him was beyond the realms of imagination for him, and it had happened. "Do we know who she is yet?" asked Margot. "Yes, next week we will visit her at her house. After we have pressed a few keys, I am sure she will receive us with some humility," said Marcus, who was enjoying the revenge he had prepared. Like a funny child with a magnifying glass and an anthill, he planned the international blockade of the Fortuna Company, the president of which would accompany them to Mrs. Chansey's house to negotiate the divorce and the grievances received. Luckily for Laura, her own company, despite the profits it provided, was out of sight and did not suffer any setbacks, so when her cousin called and told her about the problems they were having, as well as the subsequent visit from the Betson brothers and who they really were, she was really worried. Although he always thought that the ruin of the family business would be the last of his acts of vindication against his family, he realized that he cared more than he had imagined. An international phone call 2 hours before the scheduled visit gave her an unexpected advantage. Mrs. Amelia led the 2 Betson brothers, Mr. Carlos and 5 men dressed like gangsters into the living room, where Laura was waiting with Mr. Lopez and 2 other men. The 5 gangsters took up positions, one in each corner of the room and one at the door. The security was a tacit threat. Since Laura was not a danger that justified such a deployment, it was a physical manifestation of the economic force she was already exerting on her assets. The man accompanying Laura stood up and took the floor after motioning for them to take their seats. "Good morning, I am Dr. Sands." With respect to the problems caused by Mrs. Laura, as well as apologizing, we must stress that she suffers from a disorder for which she has been treated for several years. Due to this disorder and to avoid psychosomatic problems, she cannot and should not repress her temperament. Due to a significant antisocial component and the terror she feels towards people in public spaces, she has tried to stay in this house without any contact with the world. "I married a psychopath," Jeremy said, amused. Laura's look didn't intimidate him at all. If it had, he could count on the presence of the bodyguards, and also because of the distance between them, a big solid wooden table. "You have married me, it's your mistake. Can I know why the hell you are trying to ruin my company? Are you going to keep making mistakes with me, or should we stop now?" "I think you made the mistake of thinking you could assault me," Marcus mumbled. "We're just showing them what happens when you mess with the wrong person. We recognize the first misunderstanding, so as soon as the divorce papers are signed we will forget all about you and your company as if it never existed, and of course you will have to forego any and all compensation." Marcus dropped an envelope on the table. The other man standing next to Laura took the envelope and read its contents. "My name is Frederick Smither. I am here on behalf of CEO Chansey Pyong." Marcus' expression lost its arrogance. Jeremy's lost his smile and the traces of humor disappeared. "He has ordered me to be present at this meeting to witness what happens here. I have to tell you that, if the divorce is signed, the CEO will withdraw his support for Marcus' presidency and will nominate Jeremy, or, in case he does not want to go against his half-brother, he marked the word, he will align himself with the opposing side at this meeting. For his support to be unconditional, this marriage must be consummated and bring him a great-grandchild for his family registry." She smiled. "The pen, please." He asked Marcus for it, holding his gaze. She took the envelope containing the divorce papers and turned the pages to get to the end, seeming to be recreating the future signature. Jeremy snatched the pen from her hand. "Should we give this marriage a chance? I don't think we've tried hard enough." It sounded like a joke, but in the darkness of his crescent eyes there was not a glint of humor. Marcus felt utterly defeated. But I have been threatened and almost ruined. My heart is very hurt." Laura didn't even try to pretend. Her tone was totally neutral. "I imagine that with your little problem, the idea of forming a family in this way is the most convenient, but I assure you that I am not a good match, and it is possible that I will abandon you once I am pregnant, and I will surely lose the child to my grandfather, who, as you see, does not hesitate to use a stranger against his own family. Even so, I have to ask you not to sign. We can come to a non-aggression agreement. You can live in this house if you respect the rules. Your grandfather will be happy that we live together, so he will support his brother and you will give me some advantage for the company. These advantages will have to be agreed with my cousin, since he has all the information about the losses you have caused us. I imagine that we will have to triple the amount of the losses so that the matter can be forgotten without rancor. Can't we live in one of my houses? This one is too small. This house may be many things, but small is not one of them. It is more than 500 square meters per floor, and there are 4 counting the semi-basement. If you decide to stay, I'll fit out a floor for your use. Of course you'll have to contribute financially to the expenses, and you'll be responsible for any changes you want to make. No building work is allowed, in any case." Jeremy looked at his brother, slapped him on the back. "Let's secure the appointment, then we'll see. Will you be able to live here with her? I'm an easy person to get along with. I don't think we'll have any problems." Mrs. Amelia, who at that moment was dressing the table to serve a small snack, couldn't help but snort under her breath. Laura's gaze smiled at the woman, a joke that no one else had the capacity to understand. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked his brother. He shrugged elegantly. "Can I have my own service?" "No. I don't like to see strangers in my house. I need my secretary. He's really quiet and has a very nice face." "No." Mrs. Amelia was serving the refreshments with the help of a maid who was outside the door, and who was obviously not allowed to enter the room. "If you'll excuse me, I've had enough social contact for today. Enjoy my hospitality." From her tone, one would have been suspicious about the quality of the products, but as soon as she left the room, the smile returned to Mrs. Amelia's face and 2 maids who were waiting in the hallway came in to help with the service, the doctor being the first to eat, and the suspicions about whether there was poison or laxatives in the food were dismissed. They forgot for a moment that they were in hostile territory and ate and conversed somewhat normally, especially with President Chang's envoy. "How exactly did my grandfather get involved in all this?" The ambassador called him to apologize for the mistake. "He contacted his wife. Oddly enough, she sympathized with him. Psychopaths recognize each other, and often plot murder together," muttered Jeremy, who seemed to have recovered his good humor. When the meeting was over, the 2 brothers headed for the waiting car. "I will compensate you for this. When this is over, you just have to tell me what you want. You're plain. Done." "You'll have to change the name." His brother nodded. "I'll convince Grandpa to meet the psycho and change his mind, so I'm going to need him. You'll have it ready the day after tomorrow, but wait until after the meeting before you meet your grandfather. It will only be 2 weeks. I shall use this time to read and sleep." He turned to his secretary. "Send me all my things." Jeremy thought he saw him smile, but if he did, it was so briefly that no one else noticed. Before he went back inside, he called his grandfather, tried 3 times, couldn't get through to him. I imagine him having fun sitting in his Zen garden, stirring the sand as if he were just another grain. Their marriage had not only won the Spencers' support for Deborah's rebuff of Marcus's chairmanship, but by marrying she was regaining full ownership of shares that had been held in trust. Even so, his grandfather could take the chairmanship away from Marcus at his suggestion, and he didn't need to do anything more to get the majority of shareholders to follow him as if he were a guru. 5. Mrs. Amelia took her new boss up to the first floor of the villa, showed him his bedroom, the adjoining dressing room and the bathroom, perhaps expecting to see a reaction of astonishment, but she could not have known that Jeremy's own dressing room was larger than the whole of his wife's house. He showed no sign of enthusiasm, but with the eternal smile that hung from his crescent moon eyes, he eventually won over those around him. "I've already made it clear that I can't bring anyone into this house. Is there anything else I should know?" "The ladies' rooms are on the first floor, and the third floor is where she works. She must not enter any of them. Not that she can. The staircase accesses have been locked, and the lift is only used by the lady. You must not disturb her when she works. Well, not at all. Has she always been this weird? I've worked for the lady for the last 8 years. I don't know what she was like before that. I have time to find out all about my wife in the 2 weeks ahead. Let's get on with the dinner. I'd like to. I am sorry, sir. He sighed to show his innocence of her rules. Meals will be on the ground floor. I have left the schedule and menus on the desk in your room. Madam does not like to eat with anyone, but eating with you is part of the agreement with your grandfather. However, she has indicated that you can have your meals outside the house. This kind of arrangement does not interfere with the agreement with your grandfather. He waved his hand to indicate that she could leave. She approached the desk and, seeing not only the timetable for meals as if it were a barracks, but also another set of rules which she began to read, the smile left her face and her crescent eyes closed into 2 dark slits. One of the rules was that he was forbidden to use the house phone unless he agreed to have his conversations recorded, so he went for a walk around the estate to make a call. The whole estate was half the front garden of his London home. He was beginning to feel watched and overwhelmed. What are you thinking of in order to come to an agreement with this woman? He asked his grandfather, after calling more than 10 times to get her on the phone. She reminds me of your grandmother. You hated Grandma. I know. Her grandfather's laughter surprised her. She couldn't remember a time in her life when he didn't have the expression of a terracotta general about to go into battle. Your brother tried to ruin her, no matter what or how, but she is a member of my family by being married to you, and I have every right to take her under my protection. I'm going to continue with this charade because Marcus really needs your support on the board, but don't expect more from me. No one is stopping you from getting a divorce. Maybe then you'll stop living in your stepbrother's shadow and finally take some responsibility for controlling the business instead of squandering the profits. If you really want to help your stepbrother, just stay married until he has a great-grandchild. If you knew my wife, you'd know it's going to be complicated. I have spoken to her directly on the subject and she agrees. I'm busy now, you don't need to call me back. I'll talk directly to your wife in case anything happens. If you have anything to say to me, do it through her. Jeremy felt that communication and his own life had been hung up in that place on the outskirts of Madrid. He was not a completely stupid man. He told himself to cheer himself up. If he had to live in that place, at least he would procure himself some fun. It was evident that Laura had not undergone surgery and both her face and her body had imperfections that he was not used to. An uneven fang that was funny but not attractive, a small but somewhat drooping nose, and the breasts could be wonderful if only they were a little bigger and more turgid. But on the whole she was not an ugly woman, nor a pretty one. Surely she might be attractive if she did not look so much like Morticia in her expression, but so far no woman had resisted her charm. If he had to spend 2 weeks locked up in that place, it might be fun to turn Mrs. Adams into Mrs. Gray. He came back and dressed smartly for dinner. What he didn't expect was to see his wife in pajamas with a foul-mouthed cat showing her middle finger from Laura's chest, also from behind her back. The dinner etiquette is pajamas? I asked, looking at the cat's finger. There are no rules. You can dress as a samurai if you like. If it turns you on, I can try. She looked up from the iPad, smiled at him. She was almost as surprised by the expression that made her look pretty as she was by her grandfather's laughter. For some reason her brain was unable to process the symptoms of joy in either of those two people. You are beautiful when you smile, she said as if it were a miracle in itself. You're very handsome when you're quiet. Let's be handsome. He smiled at her again, but this time there was no truth in his smile. During the rest of the dinner, he planned to caress her in a subtle way, but he didn't count that she would be on the other side of the big table with everything well arranged around her, which didn't give him the option to approach her. At the end of the meal she stood up, moment that he took advantage of to take her hand. She didn't let go, she simply looked into his eyes and then into his clasped hands. He held onto her in spite of everything. Let's be friends. What part of I can't stand people and their contact is unclear. Well, you'll have to try to get over it at some point. My grandfather tells me that you agree to give him a great-grandson. Her lips closed over his mouth. He released her to embrace her, but that microsecond was used by Laura to escape. Jeremy's plans had the desired effect, but not on the right person. It was she, not he, who should feel the excitement. He took 2 seconds to react. When he reached the first floor, the access door was locked. He hesitated whether to knock or kick the door in, finally conceded the point and climbed up to his floor. His moon eyes turned 2 dark slits. She was more interesting than any woman I had ever met, but in general and in particular, I was sure that there was no specimen of any species or genus like her. The next morning, he was standing in the living room waiting for breakfast. If it wasn't for her, he wouldn't have bothered to get up just to have coffee and toast. As soon as Laura set foot in the living room, he kissed her, trying to surprise her. He quickly took his place at the table as if nothing had happened. The sad thing for Jeremy is that she didn't react to either the kiss or the subsequent indifference. It would be possible to add fried eggs, bacon, some yogurt, and something sweet to breakfast. I love apple pie. I will speak to Mrs. Amelia. May I ask what exactly is the agreement you have reached with my grandfather? It's simple. He protects me from the Betson as long as I am a Changsei. I'm not going to have any children with you, which doesn't exclude the possibility of having a good time, if you agree, of course. She smiled at him before she became engrossed in the iPad. Although he couldn't tell from her expression, she felt quite insecure. She still didn't understand why she had felt the compulsion to kiss him, but as soon as she did, she knew she had made a mistake, because Jeremy's presence in the house became her obsession, imagining every moment what he would be doing and waiting for the moment, like that, to have him in front of her, even though the emotion was so strong that she had to use all her willpower to pretend she didn't care. She thought she was a poor, pathetic woman whose loneliness had made her vulnerable to the presence of an attractive man. May I ask what you do? I'm eating. I wonder in general, as far as I know you never leave the house. What do you spend your time doing? I don't do anything, basically the same as you, but I don't need to change places. I do a lot of things. Actually, I'm quite a busy man, but I was given marriage leave. I'm curious about what happened to what was supposed to be his girlfriend. He stood me up, although I never found out, but thanks to you my heart has not had to go through something as traumatic as being abandoned at the foot of the altar. Is she a ghost bride? No one knew what she looked like. How could they mistake her for me? Well, they chose my wife because of her number of shares, and as far as I know, the shares don't have a photo indicating the holder, though I doubt the shares were in her name anyway. But it wasn't entirely unfortunate. My grandfather, who always acts against the family, because of you, has decided to lend us a hand at last. Aren't they the same family? Not exactly. My father allowed me to take my maternal grandfather's name instead of his, but he wanted to have had me in his shadow, something my mother did not accept in any way. One of the few things I agree with her. Where are his parents? My father died 2 years ago, and my mother decided to take a holiday from the family since then. I hope to emerge unscathed from this mess you have organized. They were having something resembling a conversation, although the tone contained an ill-concealed reproach. This is not something that is in my hands. I limit myself to following the orders of those who feed my cards. Don't you have enough money to live independently? I have more than I could count, but money needs looking after, and I'd rather give in on little things than have to take on the responsibility of looking after it myself. I'm not sure how you do that. I think you should look at it. I'm sorry? I have a soft spot for the mentally ill, but I like them with papers. He did not understand the sarcasm. He tried to explain the situation as he saw it. It's just business. My life is not going to change by marrying you, nor would it have changed with the original bride. In this business you will end up with a family you don't want, for whom you will probably have no affection. What sense can there be in that? I've already told you I'm not going to start a family with you. No offense, it's not personal. We'll just let Grandpa think I'm trying. I have a different kind of agreement with him, and I'm going to keep it. It's not personal, no offense. Sipping his coffee as he watched the cat fling his middle finger from behind his wife's back, he thought about seducing her as a way to keep himself entertained during the 2 weeks of marital punishment. However, he wasn't sure how to seduce a woman with so many prickles, especially in his words. On the third day, Jeremy managed to enter the work studio, where pictures of cats were ready to go and live in his wife's body. He smiled as he recognized in some of those cats the most recognizable features of his brother. He even thought he recognized his own caricature. The cat in question was up in the top of a tree as if it were a cabin boy. He wrote down the words to look up their translation. Although he spoke Spanish, it was not a language he could read comfortably. I used the Google Translator. I'm on top of the world because I don't know how to get down. The laughter alerted Laura, who was concentrating on her computer. She turned to look at him, waiting for an explanation for the intrusion. Is it me? He asked, ignoring the silent question. Are you a cat? He looks like me. It looks like a cat. Are you sick or in pain? No. Why? To know if I can throw you out without a guilty conscience. Thank you for coming. She turned around, aware that he was still looking around, but finally gave in to the silence and left. The next day, he saw her through her bedroom window. She was in the garden lying on her back with her legs and arms spread. He felt the desire buzzing in his trousers, her smile sweet and predatory. He immediately came down and stood in front of her, and his shadow covered her. She opened her eyes. You're a very attractive woman, said Jeremy, keeping his smile. She jumped up. They were less than 10 centimeters apart. Jeremy grabbed her arms and pulling her to him, he kissed her. Perhaps because of the daze caused by getting up so quickly, she didn't react as expected. She let the kiss grope her lips. Jeremy's tongue took advantage of the moment to inspect her mouth. She tasted like coffee with milk, and Laura, they let themselves go. Jeremy's hands began to move down her back and around her waist. It was when he tried to reach down her trousers that she slipped out of his embrace and out of the garden. She went up to her room and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling with panting breath. She liked him too much to let go. It took her life to stop, but Laura had decided long ago, she would never have any affection she could lose. What she felt was destined to die within a few days. She couldn't afford to yawn or she would suffer. For his part, Jeremy was in a state of adolescent excitement, that time when his desire ended by his own hand. He had never had a woman stop him before. He was angry with frustration. He went up to his room and spent more than 20 minutes in the cold shower. He promised himself to keep his desire at bay until he was sure she would go all the way. A more subtle seduction tactic was needed. He did not expect her to become even more prickly than before. If we want to give my grandfather the baby he wants, you have to stay until the end, she said, as if she didn't care too much about what had happened that morning. Laura ignored the tone and the effect his presence had on her, and began to eat the sirloin steak with pepper sauce that was on the menu. She didn't answer, causing Jeremy to grow impatient. I'll tell my grandfather that I couldn't fulfill the task of making him a great-grandson because of you. He sounded like an accusing child. She continued to slice the meat with surgical meticulousness, ignoring his words. Are you not going to speak to me? There was no response. The remaining days were silent, at least on Laura's part, who never spoke to him again. She had forbidden herself to approach him, not even with words. No matter how hard they might be, they would get a witty response, something that would put her in danger as far as her affections were concerned. 6. On the morning of the 14th of March, a car was waiting at the door of the villa. Jeremy had prepared all her luggage. If everything went well at the meeting, she had no plans to return there. She had prepared a large suitcase and a hand luggage, taking into account that the meeting would last 3 days and that she would not be present at any of the organized events. He felt obliged to remind her, to avoid absurd ideas that could cause a mistake in the perception she might have of the event. In his own subtle and indirect way. Do you plan to go sightseeing while we are in Switzerland? I'll decide as we go along. He looked at the suitcase and with his eyebrows made a motion that clearly indicated the excess baggage. It's not much luggage for Japan, but I don't plan to socialize, so it will be enough. Are we going to Japan? He asked, amused. You should talk to your grandfather more. He just replied. I will not go to Japan. She shrugged her shoulders. Why are you going to Japan? Am I wrong in thinking that we won't see each other again after your brother gets his presidency? Jeremy was too polite to tell her what he thought, which was no in capital letters, bold and underlined. He shrugged. You don't care what I do with my life, You've never been a part of it. At the airport they were driven by a private escort to a bus that took them to the private plane. Inside were all Jeremy's siblings. They greeted him with smiles, kisses and hugs as if he had been in a battlefield for those 2 weeks. After the greetings they just looked at Laura with curiosity, except Marcus, who directly decided to ignore her in a rude way. They started a conversation in English, freely discussing their first impressions. "It doesn't seem so terrible," said Margaret. "Try living with her," Jeremy joked. "Be that as it may, today is the end of your sacrifice," said Marcus as he glared at her. "Once the meeting is over, you can take your new plane around the world. Should we take her shopping?" Muriel asked, examining Laura's jeans, boots and jumper piece by piece. She simply chose a seat away from the group. Jael sat next to her. The others jokingly commented on Jael's caring and charitable spirit. However, Jeremy didn't like the way his brother looked at his wife. He also resented the jokes she didn't answer. If she had done it in her sarcastic style, he wouldn't be feeling the need to defend her. Jael took out her phone and typed something. She smiled at him and nodded, and he took her hand and led her to another compartment of the plane, separated from that one by a glass door. They began to converse in English. "Dr. Mayhe has told me a lot about you. How have you connected us?" asked Laura. "He worked with UNICEF, and the two of us talked a lot, and when he told me about you he showed me a picture. Imagine my surprise when I saw you get on the plane. You don't seem to have much in common with your family." "Family is not chosen, thank God I don't depend on them, so I do my life as much as I can. Sometimes I have to attend these kinds of events. I don't know what awaits me. When I get off the plane my life belongs to CEO Chang Say. May I ask why you agreed to something like this?" "Your older brother, I think he's a psychopath. He knows how to read people very well. He is the head of the family. The rest of us are like pets to him. If you do well he gives you a treat. If you do badly, he banishes you until he needs you. Will he give you a treat when you support him? Do you know how to keep a secret?" "No, but since I don't talk to anyone," he joked, "I won't support Marcus. It's my way to freedom. Luckily he'll get the presidency so my body won't turn up in some lonely forest." They both laughed. From where he sat with his brothers, Jeremy couldn't hear what Jael and Laura were talking about, but as his sisters joked about Laura's looks, features, and even the way she walked, he felt jealousy, something that was completely incomprehensible to him. But the sight of Laura sitting next to Jael talking amicably without the stern expression she used to give to the rest was infuriating him. Half an hour after the plane had taken off and the jokes about Laura had become boring, everyone was busy with the contents of their phones. Jeremy couldn't, though he tried, stop looking through the glass at the conversation between Jael and Laura. Neither of them were chatty people, but they hadn't stopped talking for a moment. He was unable to imagine the topic of conversation. He wasn't good at reading lips, but it was difficult to make out any words between so many mutual smiles. He was beginning to feel like a kettle on the fire. It was about to boil. Luckily it didn't get to the point of beeping thanks to the pilot's announcement announcing the landing and asking them to fasten their seat belts. She could see Jael helping Laura with her seatbelt before putting hers on. When the plane came to a stop, they both returned to the compartment where the others were. "I'm going to take Laura somewhere," said Jael in English to her brothers. "I'll see you at dinner. What's with the food? Are you on a diet?" Jeremy's tone had murderous overtones behind the joke. No one noticed. "We'll eat outside," said Jael. As soon as the onboard staff opened the door, Jael took Laura's hand and they exited the plane, walked down the runway as the driver of the waiting car looked on in a daze, while one of the escorts proceeded to follow them after giving and receiving orders through an earpiece. They walked out of the airport and took a taxi. For the rest of the day, the siblings settled into the family's chateau on the outskirts of Lausanne, each of them holed up in their rooms until lunchtime, discussing their plans, the people who would be attending the meeting, but Jeremy was absent, focused only on what Jael and Laura might be doing, and why the two had connected so well as soon as they met. He was an attractive man, Jael too, but I was sure that his sympathy was a plus that should tip the balance in his favor. "Will the Spencers be there?" Muriel asked. "Of course, You should be prepared to be harassed and flattered to the point of embarrassment by them. After Deborah's stand-up and Chancey's support, they are quite nervous about our reaction. Deborah's made a big mess of things. I suppose it's a good thing they're having a hard time," said Margaret. "Will your wife be attending the meeting?" Marcus asked his brother. "Should I?" "No, but it would be fun to see the Spencers' faces. I don't know if that's good or bad for you, though," she said to Jeremy. "But they'll be a lot more sorry for their stand-up, seeing the result." Jeremy had had a relationship with Deborah 6 years ago. It was nothing to him, but she fell in love, a risk she should have taken and worked out for herself, but she was angry with him and had a grudge that had not improved over the years. He would try to be kind and considerate, perhaps in this way, she might feel that they were evenly matched in grievances. During the afternoon they took the opportunity to enjoy themselves together, something difficult to achieve due to the agendas of each one. They went for a walk, played paddle tennis, and prepared for dinner. It was then that they noticed that the table was not ready for the services of the 2 absentees. He hesitated whether to give it to Marcus, who was the head of the family, or to Jeremy, as it was a message that affected him directly. He opted for the second option. Jeremy read the brief note, written in Spanish. "We'll see you tomorrow at the meeting, Laura. Do we know anything about my brother Jael?" he asked after putting the note in his trouser pocket. "He has not communicated." The conversation was led by Marcus, who was educating them about like-minded people and corporations and who were the hostile ones. They knew the most important ones, but there were other shareholders who were absolutely unknown to them, so these were the ones he was talking about. His sisters were paying full attention, not Jeremy, who was trying to understand how it was possible that a woman like his, who didn't even communicate with her employee, could have hit it off with Jael from minute zero. That night, he tossed and turned in his bed, changing his thoughts several times throughout the night, from that he had better forget about her since he would not see her again after the next day, to that he should mark her as his before parting, to all the ideas in between, but none of them detracted from his obsession to understand how it was possible that she could behave like a human being, but not with him. The meeting was being held in the most luxurious hotel in Lausanne, which had been booked just for this purpose. The rooms had been prepared. In the largest room the tables had been arranged in a V-shape, where the VIPs would be. A camera would record and broadcast live the management speeches of the 3 candidates for the presidency. In 3 other rooms configured in the same way, would be the rest of the shareholders who, after the speeches and a banquet prepared in the gardens, would return to the room to vote. It was at the buffet that candidates and their allies would seize the moment to win over the undecided. As if it were a film premiere, the attendees arrived in large cars that dropped them off at the door, and like real stars they walked the red carpet that led them inside the hotel. Security officers cordoned off the site by strategically placing themselves 200 meters around the site. It goes without saying that in the hotel there was a man in black every meter along the inside of the hotel. 2 photographers were stationed, one at the entrance of the hotel where he photographed and filmed the arrival of the attendees, in the lobby where a photocall had been installed with images of the headquarters of Toscana Corporation and its logo. The costumes, the jewelry and those who wore them passed by and posed to show the rest of the world what it was like to live in heaven. During the arrival everyone was taken to a hall where they were served breakfast and from where they could watch the arrival of the others. Through a whispering loudspeaker the names of those who were arriving were announced. When the name of Cheng Se-pyong and companion was announced, all the Betson looked up at the screen. The world's most powerful CEO walked alongside a woman wearing a black kimono with white collar and cuffs. They recognized Laura and all looked at Jeremy as if he could give an explanation, but he was as puzzled as the rest. They did not pose at the photocall and only their arrival was recorded, a tape that would later be confiscated so that no one outside could see it. Jael arrived at the last moment. Everyone was already in their seats for the start of the meeting, dressed in a suit that fit like a glove to a perfect body. He was handing out smiles until he reached the seat next to his brothers. The questions Jeremy had in his throat had to wait, as the act began. Not even during the buffet meal could she get close to Laura. She was glued to her grandfather, with whom she conversed as naturally as with Jael, around a cordon of his servants that prevented anyone from approaching him to get his sympathy or favors. She was furious when they prevented her from approaching her grandfather, and her rage grew exponentially when Jael passed the cordon without any problems. Jeremy left the place as soon as he had cast his vote. He didn't even wait to see the result. The image of his grandfather, Jael, and Laura having a friendly meal in a reserved area in the garden had managed to twist his guts like nothing else in his life. That Jael would vote against Marcus's presidency caused a wave of murmurs that brought him back to reality. He looked at Marcus, who tensed his jaw so that no one would notice the violence brewing inside him. He was in no mood to deal with the family crisis, so before the end of the voting he withdrew. He was about to leave when he was handed a note. 2 months in my house with your wife and I'll forget about you just like you want. The note was written in Japanese in his grandfather's inimitable handwriting. Where is the CEO? He asked the person who handed him the note. It's in the council. He took the fountain pen out of a pocket inside his jacket, designed for the pen, and wrote on the back of the note, in English, "What do I get for going to Japan?" That night, Jeremy received a call from his grandfather. It was quite a novelty. Since you are incapable of assuming your status as heir to an empire, I will treat you as you behave, a fool. What are you offering me? What does Marcus want? Asked the grandfather, expecting him to be offended, but Jeremy had no problem with his sense of dignity. We want the Betsons to be part of the corporation that is part of the Atlantis survey. Fortunately, I shall soon have other heirs who will enable me to dispense with you. Unfortunately, I need you for that. I am not going to give you anything you will come, otherwise I may be offended, and you know that when that happens the consequences are often rather unpleasant. I'm going to confess something, I can't have children. I had a vasectomy so you couldn't force me to give you heirs. You will come, said his grandfather, hanging up without a reply. 7. You have no choice but to go, Marcus told him. It will only be 2 months. If you like the idea so much, you can take my place. I wish your grandfather would let me into his domain. Use this time to get close to him. I will annul the marriage immediately if it will make you feel more liberated. All right, any child Laura may have will not legally be mine. The trip to Japan was delayed for a month, which allowed Jeremy to get back to his life. His meeting with Deborah had been just as he had assumed. She felt compensated, and spending a week together on a boat in the Caribbean ended any past hostility. Laura was quite uneasy at the thought of such a long journey with a man as annoying and fascinating as her husband. Her doctor had prescribed her pills to help her sleep during the hours of the flight. Although she was quite reluctant to take medication, she took the prescription to sleep so that she wouldn't have to have any conversation with Jeremy. She completely forgot to take it when they arrived at the airport and were led through uncrowded corridors to a boarding exit, where a plane was waiting with her husband's xerographic name on its back. She looked at him, he smiled mischievously and smugly at her. For some reason, he had the need to impress her. When he saw the interior he could not hide the surprise in his gesture. The plane staff appeared and disappeared with the speed of light, giving the impression that there were only them there. In the lounge a dinner was waiting for him, arranged on a table between 2 armchairs that seemed to fit his body like a perfect glove. The menu this time could be chosen by Jeremy: oysters, red and black caviar as starters, a wine that seemed to send a message to each of Laura's taste buds as soon as it came into contact with her mouth. He closed his eyes unconsciously and moaned. Jeremy had not expected such a thing from his impenetrable wife, and his crotch was as surprised as he was by the moan. He imagined it was his hands and not a glass of wine that caused it. He shifted uncomfortably in the seat. The past week with Deborah had failed to be an effective antidote to Laura's desire for him. He wondered mentally how this woman could have such a devastating effect on his desire. If you had allowed me to intervene in the menus, that pleasure would have been yours for 2 weeks. She opened her eyes to look at him. There was a reproach for the interruption. Let's be cute. It was the phrase she used to shush him. It had also become a lapidary phrase of her punk cat. If I am more handsome you will inevitably fall in love with me. Let's live dangerously, she said, and began to drink the wine between mouthfuls. discovering to her regret that the explosion of flavor combined with the acidity and sweetness of the wine was so perfect that she was beginning to feel like an addict. "I'll send you a box for our wedding anniversary." "Ah, we're not going to have an anniversary." "What a pity. I don't need you to give it to me, just tell me where I can get it." The tone was back to its normal unpleasantness. Laura clutched the wine bottle like a true alcoholic when they tried to take it away to bring the main course. He gestured to the hostess, who put down the bottle of wine and the glass she was using, before bringing a plate of meat and vegetables and new glasses with a different bottle of wine. She resisted tasting the new bottle, but when she did after Jeremy's silent insistence, she was surprised when the taste of meat and wine transformed the inside of her mouth into heaven on earth. If that wine was sold in cartons, half the planet would be alcoholic, and she would be the first, she thought as she enjoyed the taste. He looked at her with amusement. She seemed to enjoy the dinner and especially the wines, something I would not have imagined after seeing her choose boring and balanced menus accompanied only by water. "I have to go to the bathroom." He just pointed the way, watched her walk slightly hesitant from the alcohol, strangely feminine and sweet. His crotch conversed with him again. If he had been more drunk he would surely have pointed a finger at his crotch, reproaching him for his attitude. 10 minutes had passed since she had left the table, otherwise I would have thought she had said goodbye for the night, but there was wine left in both bottles, and from the desire I had discovered in Laura's eyes, she was not leaving behind what she liked. He got up and walked to the bedroom. He wasn't in bed. He knocked on the bathroom door. There was no answer, so he went in. This time it was his crotch that seemed to be pointing at him, to say, "You see?" She lay naked in the bathtub overflowing with water, being massaged by the jets of water and air with the perfect expression of ecstasy. "Can I have a bath too?" She nodded without opening her eyes. He didn't need a whole minute to undress and get in, although it was big enough for the two of them to bathe without having to touch each other. That wasn't Jeremy's intention, so he leaned close to her, lightly touching her shoulder. "Half an hour in my world and you're already completely enthusiastic. I'm with a point, and it's because of the wine, not because of you. Do you want me to get you a case of 10 bottles? That would be kind of you. Do you have €1,000,000 available at the moment?" She opened her eyes and looked directly into his, then looked down the length of his body. "I imagined you would be like that. It's not true what they say about Asians." His gaze was focused on the moment underwater. "You know size doesn't matter," he said jokingly, although his size was important enough that he didn't have to say such a stupid thing. "How much can it cost to have such an aircraft?" "You don't have enough money." "I have a considerable fortune." "I don't think you can afford it. It's worth more than your house and it's quite expensive to maintain." She looked at him as if she was interested in what he was saying, but in reality she was studying the perfect shape of his lips. The kiss was inevitable. Their tongues savored each other, an echo of dinner and wine. They linked arms and legs. Jeremy was eager to take her to bed, but he did not want to break that moment. His hands ran over her skin. It was like silk. His fingers began to caress her, first gently at the same time as his lips and his tongue ran inside and outside her mouth. The movement increased to the rhythm of the sighs. He was breathless, unable to think. He positioned himself between her legs and penetrated her. She arched. She wrapped her arms and legs around him. The movement splashed the water outside the bathtub. A shed moan was the white flag that ended the naval battle. He lay beside her, leaving his arm as a pillow for Laura, who seemed to be sinking into a post-coital sleep. He felt her slide to his side, and as she did so his hand gently caressed her. He smiled and his gaze rose to the bathroom ceiling. The caress was over in seconds. He turned his face towards her, who was literally submerged, and he didn't know if she was asleep or unconscious. The bubbles could be seen flying from her mouth. He jumped out of the bath and pulled her into his arms. "Laura, are you okay?" She coughed and mumbled something he could not understand. He shook his head. His erection came back hungrier. He thought of his grandfather, the only effective method of talking seriously to his crotch, as he dried her off and put her with some difficulty into a bathrobe, carried her to the bed, got her into it in 2 strokes. Sitting on the bed he studied her carefully. He mentally counted the glasses of wine. There were no more than 5, 3 from the first bottle and 2 from the second. His face was relaxed, For once he could see her without the frown of Mrs. Adams. He smiled at the glimpse of Mrs. Gray he had enjoyed for a moment. He tried to remember the time when she had not seemed pretty to him, because at that moment she was perfect in his eyes. When he got tired of looking at her, almost an hour later, he returned to the living room. The table had already been cleared. He settled into the armchair and closed his eyes in search of a few hours of sleep. The commander of the plane announced over the loudspeaker that they were landing. That was the moment when Laura came out of the bedroom. He was asleep in a strange position in the armchair. He touched her shoulder. He opened his eyes slowly and looked at her. There was something different in his gaze. She was aware of it, although she was unable to guess what it was. When he tried to take her hand, she withdrew it, a gesture that showed him they were back to square one. He got up from the armchair and pressed her back against him. "I had a great time yesterday. Do you have an agenda?" He nodded, looking at her blankly. "Yes, but I've set aside 2 months just for you. I'll buy you emoticon stickers so you can decorate these 2 months, so you won't need to share your emotions with me." She took 2 steps to keep her distance. Jeremy felt he was back to square one. 8. Laura knew she had entered a parallel world. She was aware, however, she couldn't help but be amazed at the amount of money that allowed for an airport with 3 runways and a control room 200 meters away with a boarding building. She was about to ask, but Jeremy beat her to it. "This is my grandfather's private airport. We are in the province of Nochi." She already knew this from her conversations with the CEO. "Someday I will inherit all this. I say this in case there is a materialistic woman inside you who wants to seduce me." "No one's home," she said, looking down her cleavage. Despite not being materialistic, or materialistic in a conventional way, he couldn't help mentally calculating how much an airport like that might cost, but when his maths added up to impossible numbers, he decided he wasn't that curious about it either. An SUV was waiting for them, and as they got into the car, their suitcases were placed in the boot. Laura marveled that the employees were like ballet dancers, perfect, silent, elegant and extraordinarily efficient. The remaining journey to their destination took at least 3 hours, during which time they passed through incredible and beautiful scenery, saw trails through the woods surrounding the private road they were traveling on. They took one of these paths after an hour, the leaves forming arches under the sky that cast a shadow over the road and a sense of magical unreality. The comfort of the car's leather seats, the powerful presence of the warmth emanating from Jeremy's body, the light sifting in different shades through the foliage, suddenly it all felt unreal, a feeling that was heightened when he glimpsed first a lake submerged in a mist that looked pink, then a clearing in the middle of nowhere that could perfectly well be the natural habitat of elves or fairies, and finally a waterfall cascading from an impossible height to the bottom of the ravine that could be seen from a nook in the road. The last hour of the walk was a feast for the eyes, but nothing like the wild beauty of nature, with rows of cherry trees in full bloom on either side of the road, a shower of petals rising and then floating down like fragrant confetti. The building was similar to the Oriental palaces in the movies, a wall with a roofed gate, but the dimensions were as grandiose as the rest of the landscape, the gate being 2 steel gates that opened without the car needing to stop for permission. 10 more minutes to pass through separate buildings. He counted more than 30 before giving up the attempt. Jeremy had remained silent throughout the journey. He was happy to see in her expression, so he was able to guess her mood, her surprise and fascination, and somehow, he empathized so much with these feelings that he could see what she was seeing instead of the tedious road that reminded him of the obligatory visits to his grandfather until he came of age. At last they arrived at the house, where a maid dressed in the uncomfortable Japanese costume accompanied them with short, light steps through the room. She exchanged a few words in Japanese with Jeremy, and it was Jeremy who took over to show Laura around. "Normally I would occupy the main house, but grandfather thinks it's important for the wife to feel that she owns our home, so this is your domain. It's not clear to me whether that's a good thing or not." "It is. In the main house, you have to follow the schedules set by grandfather, both at bedtime and wake-up time, meals. Now that I think about it, he's just like you." He smiled amused, remembering the printed menus of his first day at Laura's house. "Is there Wi-Fi?" he asked, Of all the questions he imagined would be rattling around in his head, it was the one he hadn't expected. Of course it is. A satellite from Grandpa's corporation takes care of that. Give me the computer so I can set up the signal for you. The password is in Japanese and Chinese. The rest of the day was spent separately until the evening. Jeremy asked where Laura was, but no one seemed to know or could answer, which, in that house, was sometimes the same thing. He took one of the electric cars that were in front of all the buildings in order to move from one place to another within the estate. He went to the main house. His grandfather refused to receive him, walked through the house he knew so well, to see that nothing had changed in the last 10 years, gave up and returned to the house he had been assigned. It wasn't dark yet, but he was informed that Laura was in bed. She was half asleep when she heard him enter the room. He was carrying a futon in his arms and spread it on the floor next to the bed. "What are you doing?" she asked sleepily. "In this house, we have to sleep in the same room, on my grandfather's orders, that nice accomplice you've found for yourself." He lied. "What nonsense are you talking about?" he asked, sitting up in bed, a cat's middle finger waved between Laura's breasts. He smiled amused. "He surely thinks that with my charm we have spent our marriage sharing a bed. He has no interest in our sex life, I know that. You can go back to your room with no regrets." It bothered her to think that he had taken advantage of her, so she didn't mention what had happened on the plane. She certainly didn't seem to remember it at all. "Because he wants a great-grandson, I suppose, whatever. The thing is, we have to sleep in the same room, or we'll be attacked by an army of killer orcs. Trust me." Even his grandfather couldn't get him to give up a perfectly comfortable bed for a futon, but he needed to sleep breathing the air she exhaled, and he didn't understand why. "Do what you want." She lay back down on the bed and fell asleep almost as soon as her head hit the pillow. Jeremy couldn't believe it. His presence had zero impact on this woman. The idea of getting her drunk to make himself look attractive to her crossed his mind for a millisecond, but he dismissed it immediately. The next morning, they were told that their presence was required at the main house, so after breakfast they left together. The electric car of the main house was waiting for them at the door. Laura was going to refuse the car, but Jeremy pushed her by the arm, taking her inside. Without words, she soon understood the reason. The grandfather's house was quite far from the one they were occupying. It was on top of a hill. A terrace overhung the building from which she could see, as she could see, the whole property, the rest of the buildings, the forest and even a temple that was in the distance but was visible thanks to the bright red color of its multiple roofs. They were taken to a room that had 4 different spaces and all of them were bigger than the floor of Laura's house. She felt a bit out of place. She heard the rustle of footsteps. When she turned around she saw the CEO, dressed in a half-suit and walking barefoot. Next to him was a kind of monk who was only wearing an orange robe. He smiled at her with complicity. Before greeting her, the old man turned to the monk and spoke to her in Japanese. Before she could even protest, a woman in a kimono was translating in a whisper. The president asked the Thai monk about his aura. She looked in surprise at the woman who appeared as a shadow beside her, the old man and the monk. The monk told the president that everything is perfect. Already? The monk has told the president that they will be the perfect mother for his great-grandchildren. Jeremy stared at them in surprise, not understanding what the hell they were talking about, feeling left out, something that was becoming a habit, a rather annoying one. "You wanted to see me yesterday," his grandfather said. "Let's talk over lunch." Laura did not seem bothered by the exclusion. The two of them ate alone. His grandfather maintained that aloof air that is used with annoying strangers. Jeremy was aware of being a disappointment to him, and his grandfather did not disguise this fact at all. "I don't know what you are trying to achieve with this pantomime. I am offering you the last chance. I know your brother annulled the marriage, yet you seem to like this woman. If I married all the women I like, I would have to change my religion. I'd like to think that the wit you only use for stupid answers could be used for something more productive. You know that I cannot have children, that the marriage has been annulled. You may even know that I am spending my honeymoon with the woman I was supposed to marry. I can't imagine what you are trying to achieve with this travesty. You wouldn't understand, and anything I could tell you would be immediately relayed to Marcus, who would understand because he is used to using his brain. "Let's be handsome," he said without thinking and smiled. "I mean, you're not going to tell me anything. It's better not to talk about anything. I will tell you something, only because it concerns you. Your marriage has not been annulled, and it won't be until I decide. You can tell Marcus, maybe he'll understand that I'm the only one who can decide about your life. I decide about my life. It's fine if that's how you see it." The meal and the conversation are over. Laura was in one of the indoor gardens with the Buddhist monk. "Let's go," said Jeremy as if they really were a team. When they returned together to their assigned house, he put his arm around her shoulders. "Let's make love until we die." She looked at him as if he had suddenly gone mad. He kissed her neck. She slapped him away. "Have you gone mad? Maybe we could go along with grandfather's charade, and pretend we're really a married couple so he'd let us leave before the 2 months were up. You're serious, aren't you? Did you find it repulsive? Let's do it." A single word, 4 syllables, got all the blood in her crotch. She didn't even consider that there was a sarcastic intention behind it. Her lips abducted her into the back seat of the electric vehicle that silently took them to the house. He didn't let her change her mind. He took her in his arms as soon as the car stopped and they entered like newlyweds. The doors were opened by the invisible employees until they reached the bedroom, where they closed it, giving them the intimacy that the moment required. Making love to her was his only obsession, his only true desire. He didn't take his lips off her until he felt Laura's hands lifting up his jumper to take it off. He pulled away to undress in 2 seconds. When he looked back at her, she was completely naked, staring at him with dilated pupils, her swollen, moist lips the most appetizing thing he could imagine. They became entangled in the limbo of the skin, with their eyes closed, feeling inside what was happening with each caress. They were dancing horizontally to a melody that sang a desire that paralyzed any thought that had to do with the strange situation in which they both found themselves. They got to know each other pore by pore, to be able to recognize each other in the dark. Before penetrating her body, he sat up to look at her. She tried to get up to pull him into her body again, but he pulled away to contemplate her. He surprised himself by recognizing the beauty and desire in a body that lacked perfect abs, whose breasts fell sideways instead of swaying in the air like the siliconed ones he was used to. But he had never wanted a body, a woman, anyone, so much. He stood over her. Before entering her body, he caressed her with his nose and his gaze, running over her face, which he then kissed with lips and tongue. When he reached her mouth, he entered, making her jump in his arms. Then it was all frantic desire that took them riding until a scream came from her like a moan. He screamed while holding his voice, a guttural sound reminiscent of a wild animal. He was surprised to hear himself and fell next to her, without releasing her. "I'm going to wash up," she said, pulling out of Jeremy's embrace, which held her close to his body. He reluctantly let her go, watching her walk to the bathroom. During the following days, they only got out of bed to eat or shower. They invented love, or so it seemed to them, although everything was written and all humans had practiced at one time or another all the movements, all the forms. They felt it as their own invention, something they could not conceive as something common, even when both had enjoyed other bodies. The caresses, the desire and pleasure was new, and they invented it with every caress, even when it was repeated in the same places to provoke the same sensations. It was a perfect 2 weeks, where only they existed. But the time and love they shared had a different meaning for each of them. For Jeremy, despite the feeling of happiness and fulfillment he felt, it was only a parenthesis in his life that he intended to enjoy until he died. For Laura it was premeditated, yet she felt she was losing the ability to handle the situation. Her heart was a little more Jeremy's with each new touch, with each kiss, with each ecstasy. So she began to put distance between herself and him, so except in bed, she kept as much distance as she could. 9. Jeremy began to feel trapped within a month, the eagerness of the first few days subsiding. She seemed like 2 women depending on where he found her. If she was in bed, she was a submissive cat, sweet and affectionate, purring happily with her caresses. But once she left the room, she was engrossed in her iPad and drawing cats of all colors and shapes. Once he looked over his shoulder to watch her work, but she turned into a sullen cat, dismissing him with her sharp claws. If they were somewhere where he could move freely, Surely that bipolarity would not be so frustrating and irritating. It was not 10 days into the first month when his grandfather sent for him at the main house. "You can leave if you wish." "Great, it's been very nice, as always, to enjoy your company. I'll let Laura know so she can get ready." "She stays." "Why?" "That was ideal. What's the point of her staying here?" "She's already pregnant. We thought it would take a bit longer, but I must admit that your playboy reputation is absolutely true." "What?" he asked, horrified at the implication. "That's impossible. You will stay married until the birth. After we register it in the family book, you can forget about me and Laura. Anything you can do against these plans will have consequences." "I can't believe she would agree to that. When you and Marcus went to Madrid and turned her family's company into toilet paper, when she realized that a mistake that had nothing to do with her could cost her her livelihood, she had no other options. I must say that she, despite the situation, made me give in to things I could never have imagined." He smiled to himself. Jeremy was so surprised that his grandfather's smile was just an absurdity on top of everything else. He wanted to ask, but he was afraid to know the answers. He figured he could convince Laura to come back with him, but he didn't count on being driven straight to his plane at the airport. Laura had prepared herself for the goodbye, but she didn't imagine that it would be so sad and painful. Since she started to take the pregnancy test, she was afraid of seeing the positive, but at the same time she wanted it. She knew that prolonging the situation with Jeremy was a crystal fantasy that would break as soon as they returned to the real world. Confirmed pregnancy was not necessary to play Russian roulette. The best thing was to say goodbye without words. She imagined him back to his world, maybe upset or maybe happy to return to his life. Laura had designed 2 new cats. The one representing the president was a hairless Egyptian cat with slanted eyes and prominent fangs reaching down to the ground, with the slogan, "Adopt me, I'm adorable." The second cat was the one representing Jeremy, with an oblique look and big eyelashes. While his gesture was adorable, he hid a bomb under his body, and you could read, "Tick-tock, it will explode in your face." She had moved to the main house as soon as she was informed of her husband's departure. Now she really felt that way, although she knew it was a sentimental and one-sided concept that had nothing to do with reality. More than a month had passed since Jeremy's departure when she heard from him. Grandfather Chansey told her of the Betsons' intention to integrate her into the family business. "As long as you are Jeremy's wife and the future mother of heir Chansey, there will be many who will want to make deals with you. This one in particular seems interesting to me. There is a brand that is only known and used by the VVVIPs of this world. They think your designs may be acceptable for their sleepwear. It is a fitting way for the world to see you as my grandson's wife," Chansey explained. "The economic conditions have been revised by my team. From now on your value is measured in hundreds of millions, never below 9 zeros. What movement is behind this contract?" she asked. "I don't know yet, but I'll always have your back. I don't trust Marcus Betson. Nothing good can come of anything he has planned. I feel safer here. There is no reason to change what we agreed. I think you have fallen in love with my grandson. I think you know it doesn't suit you, but avoiding him is not the solution. I think he has feelings for you too. Nothing would make me happier than for you to be a real marriage, then the children would have a real family. I still don't think it's a good idea. You're actually my last hope to bring Jeremy back into my life. But I won't force you. This was not in our agreement. I will. I owe you a favor that you can collect when you need it. It is not a favor that needs consideration. Still, you will have it. I do not forget offenses or favors." What they both suspected and feared had been planned a fortnight earlier on the private island where Mrs. Betson lived. Marcus went to visit her. She greeted him warmly, gave him a hug that he did not respond to with the same intensity. "I need your contacts so that your father cannot know and therefore does not interfere with my plans. It must be something important when you come to ask me personally, but you know that my help comes at a price. I am here. It's not enough. I want to be able to be by your side and take care of you like before." Marcus turned away so that she could not guess from his gesture how little he liked the idea. When he turned to look at her, he wore a knowing smile that was enough for her, who motioned for him to sit next to her on the sofa she occupied. What are you planning to do? I tried to annul Jeremy's marriage, your father got in the way, now Jeremy's wife is pregnant, we both know that's not possible. I will take care of the nullity, and if you are able to lure her to New York, I will have everything ready for that child to be aborted without anyone being able to prevent it. Marcus knew he had to pay for those promises, but she was the only person he knew who could keep them. 10. Laura signed the contract after agreeing that only 4 cats designed exclusively for the VIC promotions would be used. As an additional condition on the company's side, these cats had to be a little more subtle in their expressions, as the target audience might be annoyed if they were too ordinary. They wanted nice, friendly cats. Laura understood what they wanted, and given her current state of mind where hormones were making her change her mood every 5 minutes, she thought that being a Monia wouldn't be too complicated. The clause that he should live in the private facilities of the brand and be available to promote the collections through any media was a big stumbling block to solve, but finally the matter was resolved with more money. He would charge $100 million not for the whole work, but for each campaign, and in exchange, they excluded the availability to promote the product. However, he should submit to a photo shoot so that his image would at least be present. The CEO's plane was larger than Jeremy's and the interior was more minimalist and practical. Although there was a compartment with a double bed, the bathroom was just a sink, a toilet and a shower. All the compartments were set up as small offices, armchairs with desks and sockets for plugging in electrical appliances. During the journey from Japan to New York he slept without interruption. Sleep had become his regular and pleasant companion, along with his mood swings. The man the CEO had named as his companion was as close to a ninja as one could imagine. He did not even know his name nor did they exchange words. He had a superhuman ability to make himself understood without using his voice, something he found both convenient and surprising. Back in the car her thoughts turned to her husband. She knew she would see Jeremy at some point. She longed for him so much it hurt. It also made her cranky, so her mental conversations were between the slightly human Laura and the sociopath that inhabited her. What will we do when we meet? He'll give you a pencil and a drawing block and go drink wine with another woman. I'm sure this is because he misses me. Or because he wants an amicable divorce. I'll try to be nice when I see him. I think he has too harsh an impression of me. Ha, as if you knew. You're insane. She would have continued talking to herself in these terms had they not arrived at their destination. A man dressed in a dark suit with an earpiece in his ear led her to the car waiting in the airport car park. I hope you had a good flight, he said in perfect Spanish. Yes, thank you. My name is Josh and from now on I will be your bodyguard. Am I going to need him? I hope not, but it's always better to be safe than sorry, don't you say that? He smiled, but she just looked at him as if he had just landed from Mars. She and the shadow exchanged a glance that could mean anything. He would have to change his chip. He could only think of hooligan cats. Because of the large number of cats she would have to draw for the collections, during her trip she had been taking notes to sketch some of them. The slogans came naturally to her. That's the good thing about being an admittedly unpleasant person, she thought. However, for the first time there was a tinge of remorse. She would have preferred to be nicer to someone in particular, although it was too late and she wasn't sure she knew how to be nice either. Immediately the cat that would represent Josh formed in his head. It would be a hunk specimen with a rabbit tail, stuck to his ass. He wrote down in his notebook the sketch and a motto: only I can give you a smack, but with love. Josh tried to look over his shoulder, put his notebook away and looked out of the window, which did not discourage the bodyguard from trying to make conversation. I'll take care of your schedule, you don't have to worry about anything, I'll just tell you the times you need to be ready and I'll take care of the rest. Agenda? My work just needs a place where I can design. What else do you expect me to do? I'm afraid I can't allow you to be so kind. I need to know what events you have in store so I can refuse to go. I wouldn't want to leave you in a bad place by hiding at the last minute. Josh nodded and turned to look out the other window. He sighed, which made her look at him as if he'd farted or worse. She was sure she was much simpler and easier to deal with than the human people who were part of the parallel world she was living in. The ninja was traveling in a car that followed them. Every now and then he would look back to check that he was still there. It gave him security to have him there, It was an extension of the CEO's presence. At last they pulled into the car park of a skyscraper on Fifth Avenue. The car stopped next to the lift. His ninja was at his side before the elevator door opened.